Hi everyone, my name is Rita Fennelly Atkinson and I'm going to talk to you about translating accessibility for the lay user. To provide some context for this presentation, I want to share a little bit about myself. I am currently a technology design coach and previously worked as a special education teacher and curriculum specialist. Additionally, I am also currently a student in Sam Houston's Instructional Systems Design and Technology doctoral program. Before I get too far ahead, I want to make clear that this presentation reflects my personal views based on my experiences as an educator. I am still learning and navigating the complex issue of accessibility, and my current thoughts in no way reflect a firm position on any of these topics, as I am very much an active learner of this subject. My intent is to provide a lens into accessibility within education in an effort to further promote best practices. With that said, let me talk a little bit about how I have attempted to translate accessibility for the lay user. Our school district recently adopted Canvas, which is a learning management system similar to Blackboard, in case you are not familiar with it. As a result, I was working on teams that were addressing the need for supporting students during online portions of a blended learning experience. Blended learning means that students are provided the opportunity to learn through face-to-face interactions that include online or technology-based components to varying degrees. Within that context, there was a high need to provide professional learning to educators about how to support students using technology. From my perspective, I wanted to ensure that students with disabilities would have access to content and curriculum regardless of the format in which it was delivered. In order to do that, I began doing a lot of research. One of the greatest assets was attending the Austin Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup. The first thing I realized is that accessibility is not a topic that is discussed very much within my personal educator community. So having access to a group of individuals who had so much involvement with accessibility was not only eye-opening but also instructive. I have never seen or heard of educator preparation programs that address 508 compliance or even how to design accessible materials or instruction. So this was a very clear barrier. However, I did realize that there was a very clear entry point for discussing accessibility in public education. Educator programs do address universal design, 504 compliance, and special education. Through my lens as a special education curriculum specialist, I realized that this was the way to bring accessibility into the discussion, especially since many of the basic accessibility practices really go a long way towards addressing the most commonly needed supports for the majority of students who have a disability. In fact, if you design with accessibility in mind, you end up doing things like reducing distractors for students who have ADHD. You create more readable materials for learners who may have color blindness, vision issues, or various types of processing obstacles. I could keep going on, but this was where my thinking started. From there, I realized that accessibility needed to be translated for lay users. Teachers already have a lot on their plate, and accessible design of content and materials needed to be something that was easy. This was very difficult, and as you will see later, the way I talked about accessibility changed as I figured out how to make it an approachable task. When I started researching 508 compliance and I learned more about accessibility and compliance, almost every resource was discussing 508 compliance from the programming and coding perspective. They discussed how to address accessibility through HTML or CSS, which is really beyond the scope of what the majority of educators would need to know and also makes it seem out of reach and overwhelming. This was something I really wanted to demystify because at the core, accessibility is about fundamentals such as choices in text and color. I also wanted to ensure that the information I provided was not only rooted in compliance, but also reflected research that has gone into best practices for teaching. This was also an eye-opening experience. I very quickly realized that there was a lot of disagreement in subjects like the best font to use for students with dyslexia. My approach to this was to acknowledge and address the disagreement within the research, but then synthesize the key points of agreement and best practice. Lastly, as I went on this journey, I realized that making accessibility a part of the teaching dialogue meant that I had to really understand my audience. I spent a lot of time thinking about educators and the challenges they face. I knew that providing supports and accommodations for students with disabilities and other needs was a big motivator because that is a legal compliance issue. But I also knew that teachers do not have a lot of time. As a result, I had to learn how to present accessibility and prioritize major ideas for maximum impact. I tried to focus on the fundamental concepts that will translate into addressing the major areas of accessibility. In education, this really came down to text, color, closed captioning for videos, alternative text, and alternative options for inaccessible content. On to the fun stuff. I'm going to start with how I began to address accessibility in my first few forays. While these courses are not publicly available, I have included the presentation file links on this slide. For context, I was trying to learn how to use Canvas and model best practices. This first foray really went into detail. For example, for color, I provided examples to elicit empathy from the learner perspective, address the major principles of accessible use of color, provided guidelines and tools. Then I provided information on how to do this through a variety of tools teachers might be using. I made sure I had text and video directions and ended up creating a YouTube channel to post videos and playlists. This was still overwhelming. From there, I tried to use a tips and tricks method, and I embedded accessibility into different topics and tried to simplify it. They are not perfect, but practicing accessible design and learning how to teach others about it has really informed my practice and the way that I talk about accessibility to others. Eventually, what resulted was a host of materials that I used to recommend best practices. All of these reference documents are linked in the presentation, and I will review them in the order listed. I use different ones depending on the focus of my audience, and so some of these can be used together or separately depending on the particular need that my audience might have. Let's start with accessibility basics. This document is the culmination of all the previous work that you have seen. In a one-page document, it breaks down the basic premise for accessible design and then gives very straightforward recommendations. The idea is that if educators choose to use what is on this list, their content will likely be accessible. Every item on this list was tested using color contrast checkers, was recommended through peer-reviewed research or accessibility guidelines, or recommended by experts. By the way, I was so lucky to have access to a team of experts in dyslexia, special education, curriculum, assistive technology, and technology. They all reviewed the information and provided feedback. So if you look at the font section, you see I recommend Comic Sans, which is hated. However, educationally speaking, it is a good recommendation because young students learning to print need to have a font that represents the letters in the format in which they are learning to print. So the Comic Sans A is a ball and stick rather than the double story A most fonts use. The next document, using technology to provide accommodations and accessibility, serves a different purpose, but still addresses accessibility. One of the biggest needs is a good text-to-speech tool. And so based on research, I tested tools and provided teachers with the information to make the best choices based on how they use an online environment. The biggest issue with text-to-speech is reading math equations, and only one of the extensions I tested was usable with math operators. Then there are the video tutorials. If I could find a video, I added it to a playlist, but I created many of the videos because educator needs are very specific. The next one is the alt text decision tree for educators. I am really proud of this one. Basically, it comes down to that if the image does not serve an educational purpose, then you shouldn't be using it. And then you should make sure that you provide alt text if you are using an image. However, this decision tree is really difficult to make accessible. So modeling best practice, I translated it into a format that would be friendlier to a screen reader user. This was really difficult and actually made me realize the power of accessible design. Figuring out how to present this information really made me think about a learner and how they would navigate and access it with a screen reader. Using this lens, I was forced to figure out how to streamline the information, improve the flow, and make it efficient. It was very difficult, but I feel that this process has made me a better designer. Now, when I look at designing something, I think about how many clicks or tabs a user will need to navigate something. I think about all kinds of things that I take for granted as a user who doesn't need to use accessibility tools on a regular basis. The color contrast for Canvas and Google was about simplifying the process of using high contrast color choices. So in Canvas, I tested every color against black and white for contrast using Paciello Group's color contrast checker to create an easy to use cheat sheet that makes it obvious which color combinations meet accessibility standards. Then I did the same thing for the basic Google color palette. The idea being that if you make it simple to choose accessible options, users are more likely to use them. The last one is a basic checklist. If you read through it, you can see it is reminders about best practice with the thinking that users can use it to check their work and eventually become habit. Again, none of this is perfect, but at least I hope it addresses some of the ways accessibility could be presented for lay users. I really feel that accessible design needs to be a required component of educator preparation programs because it not only applies to technology-based content, but also to traditional instructional materials. And no matter how accessible our educational platforms are, if you embed or upload content that is not accessible, then it is a moot point.